Hi there. My name is Alan Whitehouse, and I am the Chief Software Architect of TrueSky. TrueSky is a application that helps with budgeting, planning, and forecasting. However, that's not the goal of this presentation today. Today is an educational presentation that's going to try to help you think about some topics and challenges that you're going to face when doing budgeting and forecasting throughout the enterprise as you grow, as you add more people to the process. Now, right now, all of your phones are on mute. All right, so we're not taking questions now. A lot of background noise and everything else. If you have any problems with the presentation, use the GoToWebinar chat box. Somebody is monitoring that, and we'll try to help you out during the presentation. We will also be taking questions at the end. So if you do have questions, hang on to them for now. We'll have time at the end of the webinar to ask those questions. All right, so again, think about as I'm going through. I'm going to try to be as informative as possible, but you may have some follow-up that you want to do. So every time I start this presentation, when we're going to talk about some of the challenges that you're going to face, I like to start with a very basic type of question and something to think about. And the question is, why do we budget? Okay, and the answer to this might be a couple different answers depending on your point of view. So let's talk about some of the reasons why you have to do a budget throughout your organization. One of those reasons might be compliance, or in other terms, because we have to, right? There are a lot of people in your organization that if you ask them, why do we do a budget? Their answer that comes back to you is because we have to. They don't want to, they have to. But there are other reasons why you might have to do it, right? Compliance. So maybe you have a regulatory body that requires you to give you budgets. You're publicly traded. You have to put in a forecast when you give your financials. Maybe you have a bank that requires you to give them a forecast, a budget every year in order to keep your lines of credit open. So because we have to is one of the valid reasons why you do a budget. Other reasons why you might do a budget: financial predictability. Maybe part of the reason you do a budget is to get to a cash flow forecast. So you understand, do we have to take out a loan? How are we going to be for a cash position? So you're trying to guess about your future state of your financials. And that's one of the reasons why you do a budget. All right. Why else do we budget? Well, you budget to understand the business drivers. So, maybe you are a manufacturer and you have, to buy X number of items overseas, right? So you're budgeting to understand the business drivers. You're budgeting to understand what level of staffing you might need on the production room, on the production floor in order to put together your product. You're doing that to try to figure out, do you need more square footage for your warehouse? So you're budgeting to understand the drivers behind your business. And the final reason that you tend to budget is to manage performance. Again, a lot of us are being held accountable in our day-to-day jobs. We have targets that we have to hit, whatever those targets may be. So you're doing budgets to help manage performance. Now, on this list, in your situation, you may be doing budgets because of one of these reasons, two of these reasons, three of these, or all four of these reasons. Everyone's quite a bit different in why they're doing a budget. I would hope none of you are doing a budget just because you want to do a budget, because there's really no business value in that. But you are doing a budget for one of these reasons. Now, why I bring all four of these topics up is that over the course of time, as your organization grows and changes and gets into different lines of work, and the industry around you changes and the work environment changes, why you were doing a budget last year could be completely different for why you're doing a budget this year. So you might have been budgeting years ago because you needed to get to that cash flow, and are we going to be able to make payroll? But nowadays, maybe that's not as big a concern and you're budgeting more to make sure, do we need to hire more people? So every time you go into a budget cycle, one of the best pieces of advice that I can give you is that you should ask yourself this question. Why are we doing the budget? Is it for compliance? Is it for predictability? Is it to get to the drivers? Is it to manage performance? Is it what combination? Because once you know that, how you structure your budgeting and forecasting process, what kind of information you ask, what kind of data you gather is going to be driven like this. Because if you're looking to understand the business drivers, you're going to be more concerned about the quantities of units you're going to sell. If it's compliance, you got to make sure you're hitting whatever those numbers are that your bank wants. If it's predictability, you've got to be capturing the kind of data that gets you to, say, your cash flow. And again, those aren't always the same item. So every time you go into a budget cycle, take a few minutes and ask yourself this question, and then adjust the kind of information you're looking for as you do that. All right, so let's talk about as your organization grows and what happens during budgeting. We're going to talk about all of these as we go forward. So as you grow and as you continue to budget, you're going to get more people involved in the budgeting and forecasting process. At the same time, kind of as I alluded to in the prior slide, you're going to capture different data from people in your organization. All right, so you're going to get more people involved, and you're going to do different types of data capture, and then we'll talk a little bit more about that. And as you get growing and as you get more and more things, you're going to find that the process becomes exponentially more complex. And each of these is going to add a unique challenge to the budgeting and forecasting process. Now, one side note here, when I use the word budget, when I use the term plan, when I use the term forecast, I'm really talking about the same thing. Some people, as an example, they think about budgeting as the once a year big thing and a forecast being a reforecast of those numbers. Some people think forecasting is just sales revenue. Some people think forecasting is going many more years out than the once a year big budget. And all those are all different takes on that phrase. But for this process and what I'm talking about, we can kind of use those changes interchangeably because all of this kind of means the same thing. So again, as you grow, you're going to have more people involved. You're going to have to capture different types of data than you do today, and your process is going to get exponentially more complex. So each of these is going to add a unique challenge to managing a budget cycle. And that's what we're going to kind of talk a little bit more about as we go forward. So let's talk about the different elements of an enterprise budget. And I like to think that the elements of an enterprise budget can be broken into three main pillars. The first of those is the people, what I call the people pillar. And it consists of these following sub-elements: involvement, accountability, and time. And I'm going to talk about all each of these in a moment. Then we have the data element, which really deals with what level of detail you're capturing, what kind of drivers are you capturing, external information, and timeliness. And again, I'm going to talk about these as we go forward. And then the final element, the final pillar of an enterprise budget is all around the process, which deals with accessibility, security, visibility, confidence, duration, and frequency. So let's talk about each of these as we go forward. So the first one I want to focus on is the people element. Again, as you add more people to your process, or as you grow, you're going to add more people to the process. So the first thing I want to talk about is their involvement. How involved are your people in the budgeting and the forecasting process? Now, when I say involvement, things you need to think about are not just physical involvement, right? How much time am I putting in on the budget? But also, more importantly, what is my mental and my emotional involvement with the budget? Because at the end of the day, having better mental and emotional involvement in the budget will outweigh more time, more physical involvement. So when I say mental, am I actually spending the time thinking about my numbers? Am I putting any rational thought into them and justifying why my numbers are going to be whatever they are? Are they increasing? Are they decreasing? What have you? And just as important is the emotional involvement. Do I care about these numbers? So not only am I thinking them through, but am I trying to make sure that they're correct? Is it important to me that they're proper? Because you can give your people all the time they want in the world, but if they're not mentally and emotionally involved with the budget, your numbers are going to suffer. So as you go forward, and there's not a magic answer to how you do this, but you have to look for ways to get your people not just physically involved, but both mentally and emotionally involved in the budget. Accountability. Now, I've been working doing budgeting and forecasting for more years than I care to mention. And one of the things that you would be surprised is when I work with different companies, how many times I go in and that people can put whatever kind of budget numbers they want, and there is no accountability to those budget numbers. So I say, okay, this cost category is going to be $1,000 and for the budget, and in reality, it comes out at 10,000 or it comes out at 0, right? I can be off by orders of magnitude, and there is no downside to it for me. So if when doing a budget, there's never a downside to me for doing a budget, why should I really work hard on it? Why should I care about getting the best possible numbers? So you have to think about ways of increasing the accountability, and it can actually either be through a method called the carrot or the stick, depending on what term you want to use. So as you go through and you get more people involved, look at doing ways that encourage accountability, that maybe there are bonuses or prizes or whatever in order for them to have their numbers be as accurate as possible. On the flip side, you can go the other route. There need to be negative consequences when their budget numbers are completely off. Again, as an organization, if you're trying to plan corporate strategy and move forward as a whole organization, if everyone is giving you random numbers, you can't do that. So again, there are consequences for not having accountability. Time. How much time do you give your people to do the budget? So a lot of people do one budget once a year, and it goes for a process of 3, 4, 6 weeks, whatever the case may be. But during that time, while people have to do the budget, how often do they have to do all of the rest of their day-to-day tasks? Usually what happens is I have a busy day from 9 to 5 full of work. And now once a year, you're asking me to also squeeze in time to work on a budget. Well, what happens? Well, something has to give. So either A, I don't work on my regular work as much and it suffers. I skip things. B, I rush through the budget, which means the quality of my numbers isn't as good. Or C, I end up putting in additional time outside of work to work on the budget, which ends up building resentment because I'm not spending time with family, with kids, working on mowing the backyard, whatever the case may be. So one of the things that you need to do if you want to improve the quality of your numbers is when you go through the budget cycle, the people that are working on the budget, you have to find ways to give them time, dedicated time to work on the budget. So what does that mean? Well, that means taking away some of their other responsibilities, sharing that workload, getting more people involved in the budget, each working on a smaller piece so it's not as onerous. So again, you have to find ways to give your people time if you want good quality budget numbers. So that kind of talks about the people pillar of an enterprise budget. Well, now let's talk a little bit about the data pillar. And there's a lot of things that go along with this. So first of all, let's talk about detail. What level of detail are you capturing? Okay. The first thing that comes to mind when I talk to people about capturing detailed information is we got to capture more detail. More detail is better. We got to get as much detail as possible. And in some situations, that's true. However, I'm going to ask you to take a step back and think about this from a different point of view. In your organization, what you budget for and all the stuff that you capture the budget for around, I bet not everything is material. I'm going to go back to that old style 80-20 rule in an organization where say, 20% of your customers are probably responsible for 80% of your revenue, or 20% of your cost categories are probably responsible for 80% of your cost. Now, again, that's a rule of thumb. It's not exact, but it gives you an idea. So in most organizations, probably only about 20%, give or take, of the items that you actually budget for, whether it be on the revenue, the compensation, the expense side of things, that probably drives about 80% of your cost or your revenue. So instead of trying to budget everything at a greater detail, I'm going to actually ask you to budget at a less detailed level. So identify those items that are the most material in your organization and have your people focus on those. And for everything else, take last year's actuals, maybe bump them up by cost of living increase, 2%, 5%, whatever the case may be, and just go with that, right? And what you're going to find is by having your people focus on those key things, a smaller number of items, you're going to get higher quality numbers. So again, kind of a shift in, don't budget as much, but budget less, but budget it better. Drivers, okay? When I talk about drivers, a lot of you are just budgeting now dollars. You're putting in just, we're going to spend X, we're going to get X amount of things, of dollars for revenue, and our costs are going to be X amount of dollars. I think you really should be moving towards driver-based budgeting, and I think I might show some of these examples as we go forward, depending on timing and everything else. But why is driver-based budgeting important? Well, it really gives you a better idea of where you're going to be. So let's say you're selling a product and it takes 15 man hours to manufacture one product, whatever the case may be, right? If all you know is the dollars that you're going to sell, in bulk, and you don't know how many units you're going to sell, you don't really know how many hours and how many man hours you're going to need and how many staff level is going to be. So budgeting for the drivers is something that is very, very important in the organization. Next one, external data. Too often organizations just use last year's numbers as their budget going forward, and they tend to ignore what's going on in the world around them, right? We're now living in very turbulent times, and as many of you have probably experienced, where we're at today was not where we thought we would be 6 months ago, right? So when you're budgeting, you need to strive to get your people, all of them, to look at external information, what's going on in the world around them. We're living in a smaller and smaller world. It used to be that you wouldn't face competition from halfway across the globe because of the cost of doing business and translation and shipping and all that kind of stuff, but all of those costs are dropping. So you're going to be facing more and more competition and more challenges from around the world, and things that happen on the other side of the world are going to affect your business. So as you're budgeting, you have to take into account all the stuff that's going on in the world around you, and too often people don't do that. So encourage your people to get knowledgeable about your industry, about your company, about your competition, and about the world around them, and how all of that might affect what you're doing, and that will improve the quality of your numbers. Timeliness, right? How up to date are the numbers that you're working with? So when you're doing budgeting, a lot of you are probably using Excel as your primary budget tool. And that's one of the downsides of using Excel, is the fact that you have to dump data out of your source systems, whether that be your accounting system, your CRM system, your payroll system, whatever, and you have to manually manipulate it. You got to copy and paste it. You got to get it into all those Excel workbooks. And by the time you're doing budgeting, your data is already old, right? So I have a lot of clients, right? They start budgeting in, say, October for the end of the year, but they can only give actuals up through like June or July because it takes so much work to get the actuals into these budget templates, right? So your people are always working with old data. So you really have to work on ways to increase timeliness and getting that data more up to date. Now, this is one of the areas where an application like what TrueSky does can certainly help you. But also there's a lot of tips and tricks that go along with this. So there is a copy of this presentation that gives you a lot of details and very detailed tips and tricks on like how to populate things like Excel with data from your ERP system automatically. We've got a white paper that's all about that. And if you contact BAASS after this presentation and you're interested in that, they can get you a copy of that white paper that talks about all these little tips and tricks at a detailed level of getting all these little areas that I'm talking about. So now let's move on to the process side of things. When you're doing this, so as you're growing, you're going to get more and more people involved in the budget cycle. And then the question that comes up is, how accessible is whatever solution that you're using for budgeting how accessible is it for your users, right? If I am working on the budget and now I've still got to work on all my other tasks, we talked about that in the time aspect and of the people, and I only have so many hours in the day that I can work on this budget. Let's say I get a half hour here, a half hour there, a half hour there. If I have to jump through 27 hoops and wait 15 minutes before I can even put in a budget number, then that's not a very accessible system. That's going to hurt the quality of the numbers that you're going to get in. So you need to strive to put process and applications and tools in place that allow your people to access the budget very quickly and when it's convenient for them. Maybe that is for some of your users. They want to, they're working, shift. They like to do stuff on a Sunday evening. It's kind of how they relax, right? So you have to make sure those applications are available to them wherever they are. So again, making your systems more accessible to people will help improve the quality of the numbers, because when they're in that mindset and they want a budget, boom, they can get at it right away. The next thing I want you to think about is security. And when I mention security, the first thing that comes to your mind is probably, is our data secure enough? Are we making sure that people aren't seeing information that they shouldn't be allowed to see? And yes, that is a concern. But I do want you to think about it from the other angle. I work with a lot of companies, and sometimes they're too secure on their data, right? They lock it down too much. And that actually hampers people from getting good quality numbers. Looking at the numbers that I'm in, let's say I'm in Department A, and seeing the numbers that Department B put in for certain areas may actually help me better formulate my forecast for the upcoming year. And having your people being able to see that data of other departments, other locations, other business units, what have you, can help give them some different thoughts, whether it be the actuals or the budgets. Now, obviously, there are things that you may not want people to see, like detailed compensation numbers, right? So you don't want everyone seeing who else's salaries is. That's obvious, right? But don't lock your data down so much that you hamper people from getting a good idea of what they should be able to be budgeting, okay? As a budget manager, how visible is the budget and how the budgets are building up into the final budget to you? One of the main problems with Excel is that you tend to not know how your budget's shaping up until 5 p.m. on Friday when the budget's due. And then you get to see all the ugliness that has come back from all your people. So you really need to work on checks and balances and check-in points to find out with your people, have you started working on the budget? Where are you at in the budget? What are your numbers looking at as the budget is developing? All right, because otherwise, if you wait to the end, people go down the wrong path and you don't know what they're going. So work on that visibility to the budget cycle. All right, how confident are you in the end numbers? And they're going to be accurate. Now, this confidence is kind of an overall arcing based on everything else that we've talked about here, right? In order to have good confidence in the process, people need to trust it. So your end users need to trust it. Your managers need to trust it. Executives need to trust it. So you need to build all of those processes around that people trust that the right numbers are being captured in the right format and people are putting the right thought and effort into those numbers. Now the next two I'm going to talk about, duration and frequency. They kind of go hand in hand. Duration is how long it takes to get through a budget cycle, and frequency is how often are you doing it, okay? If anything that has shown us in the last 6 months of going on and how quickly a business environment can change, it proves to the fact that you need to be able to budget on a far more frequent basis. Now, even before recent events in the world, there was a big push that people just doing a once-a-year budget, that wasn't going to cut it anymore. That kind of goes back to that external information and how small the world's getting. So as an organization, you need to be able to be budgeting at a minimum on a quarterly basis, if not be looking at a rolling forecast on a monthly basis. Because again, things can change so rapidly and you have to adjust on the fly. But with that, you have to be able to decrease the duration of the budget as you go on it, right? Because of that, you need to look to ways to shrink it down. You can't be doing budgeting every month if you let people work on the budget for 6 weeks. You can't be budgeting quarterly if you let people work on the budget process for 6 weeks, right? So you have to think about, how do we shorten the duration? That goes back to the level of detail that you're budgeting, right? and the timeliness aspect. You have to maybe say, okay, we're going to budget once a month and you get 2 days to work on it, right? So you get those up-to-date numbers. So those things that if you really want an enterprise budget that is accurate, that you can use to drive your business forward, you have to increase the frequency, decrease the duration, right? When you fail in any of these areas, it's going to ultimately decrease the accuracy of your numbers. So now I'm going to give you some real life examples of common people, data, and process type issues so you can kind of see some things and challenges to look out for as you're going forward here. So let's talk a little bit about some common people issues, okay? So as you increase the number of people that are working on the budget, you're going to have a definite increase in the number of what I call problem children, okay? Inevitably, you're going to get a group of people that have a wider range of skills, okay? So some people are going to be very good at doing budgeting and forecasting. Some people, they have the information, but they just don't know how to get it out of their heads and into a system, okay? If you're using something like Excel, you're going to have people that love Excel. They can do amazing things in it. They're comfortable. They can boom, 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 move from cell to cell to cell to cell, do their own formulas, do whatever they need, slice it and dice it, pivot tables, all that kind of stuff. Do whatever they need, and they're going to be comfortable with it. You're going to have people on the other end that are scared to death of using Excel, and just to put in 2 numbers will take them half an hour, right? Because you're going to have this wider range of skills, you're going to have to think about how do you structure all of your input templates and tailor them to the type of skill sets and groups that you have in the organization, because you don't want to simplify it so much that the complex people can't get in the kind of data that they want. But at the same time, you don't want to make it so complex that the people that have trouble with technology struggle to put any numbers in. Okay, so you need to think about that wider range of skills. You also need to put in programs to train and support your people and a wider range of people. So you just can't expect, as you get more and more people involved, that when you say, folks, it's time to start budgeting, that everyone's going to be comfortable doing budgeting. So you have to think about more training in that. Other thing that's going to happen that you're going to have to deal with as you get more and more people involved in the process is that everyone's going to want it their own way. Everyone that does budgeting think, you know what, this is the stuff I need, this is the stuff I want, this is what I think is important, right? Which is going to be different than their neighbor next to them and the desk next to them that's also doing the budget, right? So that's one of the things that you're going to have to work on. You're going to have to figure out a way to get everyone on the same page and get everyone in a, because you don't want 100 different people budgeting 100 different ways, because then you can't roll up your numbers and everything else. So you have to figure out ways to make everyone either equally happy or equally unhappy, depending on how you want to approach it with how you do the budget. But you're going to have to find ways to standardize that and explain to them why they can't necessarily have it their way. Okay. The other thing that you're going to have to keep in mind, many of the people that you work with are never ever going to be delivering on schedule. So you may say you have until the 31st to work on your budget, and then it goes to the managers for approval. Well, guess what? There will always be a subset of your employees that can never deliver on time, right? And what happens to that? Either the people that are reviewing it, the managers, they're going to get shorted with the amount of time they can have to work on the budget, or you're going to have to increase the amount of time it takes to do the budget cycle, right? Both of those are negatives. So there's not a perfect answer here, but you have to remember this, that you're going to have people that won't be able to deliver on schedule. The key is, I think, identifying those people and putting process and procedure in place to ensure that they deliver on schedule. So maybe that's find those people and have more frequent check-ins with them to make sure they're working on the budget. Are they progressing? Maybe it is telling little white lies to those people about when their budget is due. So much like dealing with teenagers and trying to get them ready to go out to the store, right? Telling them ahead of time, we're going to leave at 5 when you really don't have to leave until 5:15. Right? So they're ready ahead of time because they're never going to be on time. So there's a lot of different ways to deal with it, but you are going to have to deal with it. Okay, security concerns, right? As you get more and more people, you are going to have security concerns, right? If up to this point, only people that were working on the budgets were the people that also had full access to the accounting system, meant that you probably didn't have a lot of security concerns about your data because they knew what the CEO was being paid. They knew what you were paying in taxes or what your rent was or whatever, right? But as you do open it up, there are things that you're going to want to think about. Should you let your people see it or not? Now, think back to what I said. You don't want to lock things down so tight that you're hampering people from having the information they need to do their job and to get you high quality numbers. But you do have to be cognizant of the fact that there are security concerns. Also, as you add more people to the budgeting process, there is a greater chance that some of your confidential information will be walking out the door, right? This is another one of those areas where you might want to think about getting an application to use for your budgeting and forecasting process. It's going to have tighter security than embedding everything in an Excel workbook that can be emailed out to a Gmail account, and there goes all of your corporate data, right? So again, you will have some security concerns that you need to think about when it goes for that. Again, I alluded to this earlier when you talk about people issues, is that you're going to have loss of work time. You're going to have loss of work time there. So think about it as you're going forward, that you have to figure out how people are going to do the budget, do a quality budget, but then what happens to their other tasks that need to happen on a day-to-day basis, okay? Final thing that I think is very, very, very important. And it's one of those things where if you only take a couple things away from this presentation, this is one of those items. Who owns the numbers? Oftentimes in an organization, you've probably had this. Somebody works on the budget. You then do a budget to actual review 6 months later, and somebody says, hey, those aren't my numbers. I don't know how those numbers got in there. You can't hold me accountable to those numbers. Why did that happen? Well, odds are I put in numbers as a frontline person. Somebody else, then in the review process, a manager, a VP, whatever, edited those numbers, and they never told me that my numbers had changed, right? So you need to decide who has final ownership of the numbers. My personal recommendation, take it for what it's worth, is that you should only ever have the frontline people make changes to numbers. And as your numbers go through the review process, if you don't like a number, you tell them why, you send it back to the frontline people who then make those changes and resubmit for approval. That way, everyone is on the same page. You can never have those conversations with, hey, I didn't know you made those changes. You know, you're not holding me to that, right? It's all about that ownership. So that's my recommendation. I think it works well. But again, you have to do whatever you need to do in your organization. Let's talk about some common data issues, okay? Well, as you're going to increase your budgeting and forecasting, you're probably going to budget for and forecast for more different things. So maybe today you're just doing expenses, right? But maybe down the road as you grow, you need to do, because payroll becomes a bigger and bigger portion of your expenses, you may need to do detailed compensation planning, which carries a lot more complexity to it. Not only are you doing stuff by employees, you're tracking things like what are benefits going to cost, what are salaries going to cost. Again, it just increased the level of complexity. And you need to be prepared that both in preparing for your budgeting and forecasting cycle, that's going to take longer. And it's also going to take your people longer to fill out more detailed information. Okay, so keep that in mind. This is, again, another one of those areas where having a budgeting and forecasting application as opposed to Excel is going to help you out dramatically. Again, you want to be moving to capturing the drivers, rates, quantities, square footage, number of customers, number of sales, and the dollars, because that's going to give you better information for working and making business decisions. Keep in mind, you're going to have a lot of more spreadsheets and more versioning, so you're going to have to put in programs and process to deal with that. Right, and that can become a full-time job for somebody as you get large. I had a client once that was using Excel, and to get through their budgeting and forecasting cycle every year, they were creating 400 unique Excel workbooks to manage the budget and forecasting process, because that's how they were dealing with populating of data and security, and because Excel isn't multi-user, right? You can imagine the cost that went along with that. especially the one time where they put it out and 4 weeks into a 6-week budget cycle, they had to pull them all back and start over again because they had problems and material errors in what they populated. Again, these are all data issues that you're going to deal with as you grow. And again, these are the kind of things where you might want to think about an application as you go forward, because it will minimize all these for you. You're all familiar with broken linkages. Those just get work. And then the kind of the hassle of storing and sharing backup documentation. Now, one of the things that I really want to think about is what I'm going to show you here next, because this is kind of where you can go when it gets out of control. So what I'm showing you right now on screen here is an actual template I got from a client that we were working with. Okay. Now at first blush, this doesn't seem too bad. Okay. By quarter, they were budgeting on a quarterly basis here. They were putting in some numbers. You had the quarters across the top. You had some different cost categories down the side, right? And you had a couple different shadings here. A little confusing, but again, it showed you stuff. But if you notice, I'm showing you the workbook at 100%. If you wanted to see the exact form we're asking their people to fill out, you had to zoom out to 12%, okay? This is what it took to capture all the information, all the calculations that the finance group needed as they grew and they got larger. The problem with this format is, I can guarantee you as an end user, by the time I started on the left and got all the way over to the right, there was no way I could remember what was on the left. I would have to scroll back and forth, back and forth. Same thing up and down, right? It's just way too much for the human brain to process. So yes, this gave them everything they needed to do their budget numbers, but the quality of the numbers they were getting was horrible because their people just couldn't process it. So you got to think about that as you're going forward. These are all problems that you're going to deal with, okay? So let's talk a little bit more about the common process issues that go along with this. So people tend to start focusing as they're doing budget on the what, like the hard number. I'm focusing on the number and not so much the why. The why the number is going to be what the number is going to be is more important to you than actually the number. Knowing the why is this number going to increase? Why is this number going to decrease? Is really going to give you the information you need to make informed business decisions, not necessarily what the number is itself. So make sure when you're training your people, when you're asking them for information, that you ask them not just the what, but the why that goes along with it, because that's how you're going to make some better numbers. Okay. Increasing cycle times, right? As you get through the process, right? It's going to take more effort to manage this process. It's going to take more cost of running a process as you get more people, more forms, everything else. And that only gets exacerbated when you do yearly versus quarterly versus rolling forecast, right? So you really need to think about your cycle times and how you're going to keep those times from increasing dramatically. Again, one of the ways you're going to want to look at it is this becomes a pain. You're going to want to look at investing in a budgeting and forecasting application, because again, this will kill you as an organization. And I've talked a little bit about it before, is not just who owns the numbers, but who owns the business process. I have worked with clients, believe it or not, that have, part of the process is managed by the HR group when it comes to compensation. Part of the process was managed by the finance group, but they were on different cycles. So people would be budgeting at a different cycle for HR than they were for finance, but the HR numbers would affect their department budget and so forth. So you need to make sure that you have one person that's in control of all the process and ensuring everyone is doing what they want in a timely manner, in sync, and everything else. So that kind of gives you some idea to the process issues. Now, again, the white papers that we have that go along with this will detail a lot of these in more detail. We also, by the way, have a white paper that if you are continuing to use Excel, that gives you a whole lot of tips and tricks on how to manage the process in Excel and minimize the pain that goes along with it. Now, before we wrap up, just a little bit of background around me so you kind of know where all this is coming from, right? Again, I don't like to bore people up there at the front of this, but I work for a company called TrueSky. we do a budgeting and forecasting and planning application. BAASS is one of our partners, so they can actually help you with a budgeting, planning, and forecasting application if Excel is starting to cause you a lot of pains. I've been doing this now, I should cycle that forward now, for 25 years. Working in this industry, so I've worked through a lot of different clients. If there's been an industry at some point, I've probably worked with it. So all of this information I've given you has come from different industries, as well as a different variety of sizes. So at this point, I'm going to stop and open this up for questions. Now, if you want to learn a little bit more about TrueSky, please visit our website. You've got my information up on the screen there. Again, by all means, contact your BAASS account manager if you want to learn a little bit more about this. But now I am open to answering any questions if you want to pick my brain about budgeting and forecasting and planning. It doesn't have to be related to an application at all. It could be process related, it could be Excel related. Things that you think about maybe doing, and so forth. So I'll shut up now and use the chat bar if you have any questions. I do thank you before you drop off for taking time out of your day to listen to this presentation. But with that, please ask any questions that you may have.
Thanks, Alan. So we do have a few questions here already, and anyone who has more questions, feel free just to enter them in the chat. But the first question I have is, do you have any suggestions for getting people more involved in budgeting?
Yeah, so budgeting is one of those things where I don't think you can ever make people, stand up and cheer when you go, hey, it's time to start the yearly budget, right? No one's gonna like to do it, right? I think there are a few people that love doing budgeting, but most of the people aren't, okay? So how do you encourage people to do the budget? How do you get them more involved? I like the concept of incentives, right? I make it a game. Making a game may not be the right terminology, but it kind of expresses the concept here. Think about this. Okay, run a prize, right? So the person who 3 months in, who gets the closest on their budget to their actual numbers for Q1 or Q2 or whatever the case may be, a gift card. It doesn't have to be something big. A $25 gift card to the local, bar or restaurant, something like that, right? Little things like that. If your department hits their numbers closest to the budget, we're going to buy you a pizza lunch. It's things like that that, it's not going to take away the drudgery of doing the budget, but at least now there's a little bit more of an incentive. There's something that if they get it right, both from a team and a personal point of view, that might encourage a little bit better work on the numbers and getting them more involved with that, because now they've got a little bit more stake in the game, so to speak.
The next question I have here is, do you have any tips for how to merge spreadsheets with the least amount of pain?
Great question. So this is one of those questions. I was talking about a white paper that we do. And there's a white paper that we do. And again, as you drop off, talk to BAASS, request it, we'll get you a copy of it. And it really does detail some tips and tricks about that whole, how to set up your spreadsheets, how to prevent people from doing some things that break those merges, and how to merge multiple ones into one master one. So it's the kind of stuff that's tough for me to describe here verbally, but we do have a thing that details how to do it. So by all means, ask for a copy of it. Be more than happy to send you out a copy, and it will walk you through that process. So yes, I do. Get a copy of the white paper, and then that'll help you out.
The next question I have is, where do you suggest storing instructions for budgeting process so everyone looks at them?
Great question. Don't do it in an email, okay? First of all, we all get way too many emails. We all get way too many spam emails. We don't read them and everything else. If you're gonna use Excel, use that first worksheet tab. So the first worksheet tab, call it instructions, put your instructions, your guidance, your rules, your dates, everything into that first worksheet tab. That way, every time they open up the Excel workbook, that first tab is right there for them. It's got everything they need. They don't have to try to go and find an email that they may have deleted, they may never have seen. There's no excuses. It's right there every time they want to do it. So always put it there as that first tab in Excel.
And the last question I have here is, how do you start with zero-based budgeting?
Oh, great question. So for those of you that aren't don't know what the concept zero-based budgeting means, Zero-based budgeting means that when I ask somebody to go budget for the upcoming year or quarter or whatever, I don't provide them information on, say, what was last year's budgets or what was last year's actuals. You're basically budgeting from a clean slate. Zero-based budgeting has the advantage of avoiding what I call budget inflation, where what somebody does is they just look at last year's actuals or last year's budget and says, you know what, I'm just going to take all those numbers and bump them up by 5%, without giving any thought to whether or not this category should be 5%, maybe it should be 20%, and maybe this other one should actually be decreased, right? Because they're just taking those numbers. It's kind of a crutch. So zero-based budgeting is really budgeting from a blank slate. The one downside of zero-based budgeting is it's a lot more labor intensive. It takes more time. People have to put more thought into it. It's more mental effort. It's more physical effort because they're having to think through all their numbers. Again, it gives you far better quality numbers, but it is more effort. So how do I recommend doing it? It's kind of the subset of when I was talking about the amount of detail you budget for and budgeting less. So what I would do as a first step into zero-based budgeting, for all the rest of their budget, give them the prior year's actuals, the prior year budgets like you were, and then focus on that 80-20. And then within that 20% that you're going to really want them to focus on, find maybe the one or two key things, your one or two biggest items, and only zero-based budget the one or two biggest items. The rest, they can copy paste, they can just increase by 5%, whatever. But those one or two items that can be material to your budget, just have them zero-based budget those, focused on those, and that way you're going to get the best quality you can with the least amount of effort for those items that really matter to your organization. So that's how I would approach that as a stepping stone to zero-based budgeting.
Okay, and with that being all of the questions that I have right now, I'd like to thank everyone for taking time out of their busy days to attend, as well as you, Alan, for presenting today. A recording of the webinar will be sent out via email once it is available, and I hope that everyone enjoys the rest of their day.
Thanks, folks.
Thanks, everyone.